She left with one bag. And took the future of the estate with her. They told her she would leave with nothing, and for 11 years she had believed them, which was its own kind of theft, because believing a lie that long is a way of letting someone steal your whole life without ever touching your hands. Margaret Hale stood in the small attic room she had occupied since she was 19 years old and looked at the single canvas bag on the narrow bed. It held 2 dresses, a comb that had been her mother's, a tin of letters tied with string, and a wooden bird her father had carved before the fever took him. 11 years of a life folded down into something a woman could carry in one hand across a frozen field, and somehow this felt less like loss than like finally being weighed accurately for the first time. The house below her was Ashcombe Manor, and the man who owned it was dying in the East Wing with the slow, furious patience of someone who had spent his entire life refusing to be told what his body intended to do, and was not about to start agreeing with it now over something as undignified as a failing heart. His name was Edmund Voss, and he was the reason Margaret had a bag at all instead of a future. It had not always been a punishment, this house. There had been a season, brief, almost unbearably bright in memory now, when Ashcombe had been the place Margaret went to feel like a person instead of a function. She had arrived as a companion to old Lady Voss, Edmund's mother, hired at 19 for her steady hands and her steadier nerves, and she had stayed because somewhere in the slow turning of those first 2 years, she had stopped being able to imagine leaving. She had loved him before she understood what the feeling was called. It had started, if it could be said to start anywhere, with the library. Margaret had a habit of reading in the window seat at the end of the long gallery, where the afternoon light came through warm and amber and made even sad books feel survivable, and Edmund had a habit of walking the gallery at the same hour, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark head bent in the particular concentration of a man working through an estate problem that had no clean solution. For weeks they had not spoken. Then one afternoon he had stopped at the window seat and asked, without any preamble at all, what she was reading, and she had told him, and he had sat down across from her on the opposite bench without being invited, and that had been the entire courtship in miniature, 2 people who simply began occupying the same space until the space did not make sense without both of them in it. She remembered the exact week she understood she loved him. It was not a dramatic week. He had been unwell with a chest cold, confined to his rooms, irritable in the specific way of someone who hated being managed, and Margaret had brought him broth he did not want and read to him from books he pretended to find tedious, and on the 4th evening he had caught her wrist as she set down the tray and said, with the particular rawness of a man too tired to manage his own face, that he did not know what he would do in this house without her in it. She had not slept that night. Not from anxiety. From the specific, terrifying joy of being told that you matter to someone in a way that has nothing to do with your usefulness. For 2 years after that, there had been an understanding between them that neither had named formally and both had treated as more binding than any spoken vow. Margaret had told herself this was enough, had told herself, with the particular discipline of a woman raised to expect very little, that a man's hand finding hers in the dark of a corridor, that the specific tenderness in his voice when he was tired and unguarded, that the way he looked for her face in any room he entered before he looked for anything else, constituted its own kind of promise even without a ring attached to it. Then his mother had died, and Lady Voss's death had changed something in Edmund that Margaret had never fully understood and had spent years quietly grieving without a name for the grief. He had not become cruel. That would have been simpler, in its way, cruelty she could have fought, or fled, or at minimum understood. What he had become was distant in the specific, devastating manner of a man who has decided that closeness is a debt he cannot afford to keep incurring. He had stopped seeking her out in the gallery. He had stopped catching her wrist in the dark corridors. He had married, 18 months later, a woman named Lucia Faraday whose family connections solved a financial problem Margaret had not even known existed, and he had done it with the flat, efficient grief of a man performing a necessary surgery on his own life, and he had never once, in the years since, given Margaret any indication that he remembered what had passed between them in that library window seat. Margaret had stayed at Ashcombe anyway. She told herself it was because Lady Voss, in her final months, had asked her to remain and look after the household in her absence, and because leaving would have meant abandoning the only home she had left in the world, and because, this was the part she allowed herself least often, leaving would have meant admitting that something real had happened and had then simply stopped happening, the way weather stops, without apology or explanation. She had stayed for 11 years as housekeeper of a home she had once been on the verge of calling her own. And now Edmund Voss was dying, and his wife Lucia had decided, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had never once mistaken sentiment for strategy, that a household in mourning had no further use for a housekeeper whose wages came from an estate that would shortly belong to someone else's accounting. "You will be compensated for your service," Lucia had said that morning, standing in the doorway of the small sitting room with the particular coldness of someone reciting a line she had prepared in advance. "The carriage will take you to the station by noon." Margaret had not argued. She had learned, over 11 years, that arguing with the architecture of a house that was never going to be hers was simply a way of bruising herself against a wall that did not care whether it hurt you. She had gone upstairs. She had packed the bag. She was tying the string around the tin of letters when she heard footsteps on the attic stairs that did not belong to any servant in the house, heavier, uneven, accompanied by the specific dragging hesitation of a man who should not, by any medical account, be climbing stairs at all. The door opened without a knock. Edmund Voss stood in the frame in his dressing gown, pale in the particular way of a man whose blood had given up arguing with his heart, his dark hair silvered now at the temples in a way it had not been 11 years ago, his eyes, the same eyes that had once found her face across a library before anything else in any room, fixed on the bag on her bed with an expression Margaret had not seen on him since the week of his mother's death. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. Margaret finished tying the string with hands that did not shake, because she had promised herself a long time ago that whatever else happened in this house, she would not give it the satisfaction of seeing her shake. "Your wife has made the arrangements," she said. "The carriage comes at noon." Edmund did not move from the doorway. He looked, in that moment, less like the master of a great estate and more like a man standing at the edge of something he had spent a decade pretending was not a precipice. "I did not ask her to do this," he said. "You did not ask her not to," Margaret replied, and the words came out quieter than she intended, carrying 11 years of compressed restraint in 4 syllables. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, not quite shame, something closer to the specific expression of a man finally confronted with the full weight of every choice he had spent a decade declining to examine. "Margaret," he said. And then, because his heart had been failing for the better part of 2 years and the climb up 3 flights of attic stairs had asked more of it than it had left to give, Edmund Voss put his hand against the doorframe, and his knees gave out beneath him, and he went down onto the attic floor in front of her with a sound that stopped Margaret's own heart more completely than anything that had happened in this house in 11 years. She was on the floor beside him before she had any memory of crossing the room. His breathing was shallow and fast, his lips faintly gray at the edges, his hand closing around her wrist with a grip that carried no strength at all, only the desperate reflexive need of a body trying to hold on to something solid while everything else came apart. Margaret did the only thing she knew to do, loosened his collar, called down the stairwell for the footman in a voice that did not sound like her own, pressed her palm flat against his chest as though she could hold his heart together through sheer force of contact. "Stay with me," she said, and she heard, with a kind of distant horror, that she was crying, that she had been crying for several seconds without noticing, that 11 years of careful composure had simply dissolved the instant his body hit the floor in front of her. Edmund's eyes found her face. Even now, even with the gray creeping into his lips and his breath coming in shallow tears, he was looking for her the way he had looked for her across the library all those years ago, as though her face were the one fixed point in a room that had otherwise come loose from its moorings. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice barely a thread of sound. "I am not afraid of this part." "Do not talk," she said. "Save your breath." "I have saved it for 11 years, he said, and something in his voice, broken, raw, finally entirely without armor, made Margaret's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with fear for his life and everything to do with the specific grief of hearing a man finally say the thing he should have said a decade ago, at the exact moment when saying it might cost him the chance to say anything else at all. The footman arrived. The doctor was sent for. Edmund was carried down to his own rooms by 4 men who handled him with the careful, practiced gentleness of servants who had been bracing for this exact morning for months, and Margaret followed behind them because no one told her not to, and because she discovered, in the chaos of the descending stairs, that she could not have stopped herself from following if the entire household had formed a wall against her. Lucia was waiting in the East Wing corridor when they brought him in. She did not look at Margaret. She looked at her husband's grey face with an expression that Margaret, even in her own panic, recognized immediately as something other than grief, a flat, calculating alarm, the specific anxiety of a woman doing arithmetic on a future that had just become considerably less certain. "Send for Dr. Abernathy," Lucia said to the footman, her voice clipped and steady. "And have the solicitor summoned as well. If matters are to be settled, they should be settled while he is still capable of signing anything." The casualness of it, the easy slide from her husband's collapsing body to the question of his signature, struck Margaret with a force that was almost physical. She had spent 11 years quietly absorbing every form of coldness this house had offered her, and she had told herself, across all of that time, that perhaps Edmund's marriage to Lucia had simply been the practical decision of a practical man, that perhaps there was warmth between them that Margaret simply was not permitted to witness. Watching Lucia's face in that corridor, Margaret understood, with the specific clarity that arrives only when it is far too late to be useful, that there had never been any warmth to witness. Dr. Abernathy arrived within the hour and emerged from Edmund's chamber 40 minutes later with the careful, measured expression of a man delivering news he had delivered too many times to too many families to have any illusions left about how to make it kinder. "His heart is failing," the doctor said, addressing Lucia first, as propriety demanded, though his eyes moved once, briefly, to Margaret standing in the corridor with her hands still trembling from the climb down the stairs. "It has been failing for some time. Today was a warning, not yet the conclusion. But the conclusion is coming, and I would not ask it to wait for a convenient season." "How long?" Lucia asked, and there was no tremor in the question at all. "Weeks," the doctor said. "Perhaps months, if he rests entirely and avoids all distress." He paused, and something in his careful clinical neutrality cracked just slightly. "He is asking for Miss Hale." Lucia's face did not change, but something behind it did, a small, swift recalculation, the look of a woman deciding that a battle not worth fighting in front of witnesses could be postponed to a more private venue. "She may see him," Lucia said. Briefly. Margaret went into the chamber with her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the stairs. Edmund was propped against a bank of pillows, his color slightly improved but still wrong, still carrying the particular pallor of a body that has frightened itself badly. His dark eyes found her the moment she crossed the threshold, and something in his face loosened, not relief exactly, but the specific unburdening of a man who has been holding his breath against the possibility that she might not come. He had asked the doctor to leave them. He had asked, apparently, with enough insistence that even the careful structures of a sickroom had bent around the request. "Sit," he said, and gestured to the chair beside the bed with a hand that trembled only slightly now. Margaret sat. She did not trust herself to speak first. "I have been a coward," Edmund said. The directness of it, after 11 years of silence on the subject, struck her like cold water. She had imagined, in the privacy of her own grief, 100 different conversations they might one day have, and none of them had begun this way, with him simply handing her the truth without ceremony, the way a man hands over a debt he has finally decided he can no longer carry alone. "You do not have to do this now," she said, though her voice betrayed how much she wanted him to do it anyway. "I have to do it now precisely because there may not be a later," Edmund said. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, and the warmth of his fingers closing around hers undid something in her chest that 11 years of careful distance had been holding very carefully closed. "When my mother died," he said, "I made a decision about what kind of man I was going to be. I decided I was going to be the kind of man who did not need anyone enough to be undone by losing them. I had just watched what losing someone did to me, Margaret. I watched myself come apart over my mother's death in a way that frightened me more than the death itself did. And I looked at you, and I thought, if I let myself need her the way I need her, and then I lose her too, there will be nothing left of me at all. So you decided to lose me on your own terms instead," Margaret said, and the words came out with more bitterness than she had intended to allow herself, 11 years of swallowed grief finally finding a crack to escape through. Edmund's eyes closed briefly, as though absorbing a blow he had been expecting and had still not fully braced for. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I did. I married Lucia because marrying her required nothing of my heart, and a heart that is required for nothing cannot be broken." He opened his eyes again, and what was in them now was not the careful, controlled grief of the man Margaret had watched for a decade, but something raw, something that looked very much like the boy who had sat down across from her in the library window seat without being invited. "I have been so careful for 11 years, he said. "I have been so careful, and so safe, and so completely empty, and I did not understand until I was lying on that attic floor looking up at your face that the entire architecture of my safety was built on a foundation of having thrown away the only thing that ever made me feel like a whole person." Margaret felt the tears come again, and this time she did not try to stop them. "You let me believe none of it mattered to you," she said. "You let me spend 11 years thinking I had imagined the whole thing, the library, the broth, the week you were ill and told me you didn't know what you'd do in this house without me. You let me build my entire understanding of myself around the idea that I had simply misread a kind man being kind, because kind men do not marry someone else 18 months after they tell you they need you. I did not believe any of it had stopped mattering," Edmund said. His grip on her hand tightened. "I believed that if I let it keep mattering, I would not survive losing you the way I did not survive losing my mother. So I decided in advance that I would survive by never fully having you to lose. It was cowardice dressed up as practicality, and you paid the entire price for it while I told myself I was being responsible." The room was quiet except for the small, persistent sound of the fire and the rain that had begun against the tall windows sometime during the morning's chaos. "I am dying, Margaret," Edmund said, and his voice cracked open on the word in a way that made her chest ache with a grief she had not yet let herself fully feel. "And I find that the only thing I actually regret, lying in this bed, is not the estate, not my name, not anything Lucia will inherit when I am gone. The only thing I regret is the 11 years I spent protecting myself from loving you properly, when loving you properly was the only thing in my entire life that ever made me feel like I was not simply managing an inheritance, but actually living inside it." Margaret pressed his hand to her face, feeling the tremor in it, feeling the warmth that had not, after everything, gone entirely cold. "Then do not waste whatever is left being careful," she said. Edmund's mouth curved into something that was almost, despite everything, a smile. "No," he said. "I do not intend to. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself as grief, it simply accumulates, year over year, in the small silences between two people who loved each other and let fear convince them that silence was safer than the risk of being truly known. If you have ever loved someone and let your own fear build the distance between you, if you have ever spent years quietly believing that your feelings have been imagined rather than simply unspoken, you already understand exactly what is happening in this room with Edmund and Margaret right now. This is why this channel exists. Not for the easy stories, where love arrives without cost. For the stories where two people have to excavate years of buried fear before they can finally say the thing that was always true. If this story has found you in a moment when it means something, subscribe to Regent Hearts right now. Hit the bell so you do not miss what happens next. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to dig through years of silence to find your way back to someone? We read every single comment, and this community exists because of stories just like this one. What happens next in that sick room is going to change everything Margaret believed about the last 11 years of her life. Stay with us. Lucia Voss did not knock before entering her husband's chamber the following morning, and what she found there, Margaret asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand still loosely held in Edmund's, her head tipped against the wing of the chair in the particular unguarded posture of someone who had finally allowed exhaustion to claim her after a night of vigil, confirmed every calculation Lucia had been quietly making since the previous afternoon. She did not wake either of them immediately. She stood in the doorway and watched, with the cold, assessing patience of a woman who had built her entire marriage on the careful management of appearances, and who now understood that the appearance she had spent 8 years maintaining was about to become considerably more difficult to sustain. When Margaret woke and saw her in the doorway, she rose from the chair too quickly. The old instinct of a servant caught somewhere she should not be still operating in her body even now, even after everything that had been said in this room the previous evening. "We need to speak," Lucia said. "Privately." Margaret followed her into the small adjoining sitting room, leaving the door ajar behind them, some part of her unwilling to be entirely out of earshot of the man sleeping in the next room. Lucia did not sit. She stood by the cold hearth with her arms folded, and when she spoke, her voice carried none of the brittle coldness of the previous day's dismissal. It carried something else entirely, a tired, resigned honesty that Margaret had never once heard from her in 11 years of careful distance. "I know what you were to him," Lucia said. "I have known since before we married." Margaret felt the floor tilt slightly beneath the words. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though the words came out without conviction, because she suspected, with sudden and complete certainty, exactly what Lucia meant. "You do," Lucia said. "Edmund told me, before we married. He told me there had been someone in this house he cared for deeply, and that he had decided, for reasons he did not fully explain to me at the time, that the caring could not continue. He told me he needed a marriage that asked nothing of his heart, because his heart, in his words, was no longer a reliable instrument." She paused. "I agreed to those terms, because I needed a marriage that solved a different problem entirely, and a husband who did not require my heart suited me precisely as well as a wife who did not require his." Margaret stared at her, the entire architecture of 11 years of assumed rivalry quietly dismantling itself in real time. "Then you were never," Margaret began, and could not finish the sentence. "In love with him," Lucia finished, with the flat, unembarrassed honesty of a woman long past the need to perform feelings she had never had. "No. I respected him. I managed his household efficiently and he managed my family's debts efficiently, and for 8 years that arrangement suited both of us perfectly well." She looked, for the first time, almost tired. "I did not dismiss you yesterday out of jealousy, Margaret. I dismissed you because I believed, with my husband dying, that the kindest thing I could do for both of you was to remove the temptation of reopening something that could not end well for either of you, given how little time remained." Margaret sat down slowly in the chair nearest her, her legs no longer entirely willing to hold her. "That was not your decision to make," she said, though there was no anger left in her voice, only the bewildered exhaustion of someone trying to reorganize 11 years of assumptions in the space of a single conversation. "No," Lucia agreed. "It was not. I see that now, watching him this morning. I have not seen Edmund look the way he looked last night in 8 years of marriage. I am not certain I have ever seen him look that way at all." She crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and opened the bottom drawer, withdrawing a thin packet of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and held them out to Margaret with the particular care of someone handling something they understood to be more valuable than they had perhaps fully appreciated until this moment. "These are yours," Lucia said. "He wrote them. Over the years. He never sent them. I found them 3 years ago when I was reorganizing his desk, and I read the first one before I understood what I was reading, and then I could not stop myself from reading the rest, though I have regretted the intrusion every day since." Margaret took the letters with hands that had begun, finally, to shake. "Why are you giving them to me now?" she asked. "Because I am tired," Lucia said simply, "of being the reason two people who loved each other spent over a decade pretending they did not." She moved toward the door, then paused, her hand on the frame. "Whatever time he has left," she said, "I would like him to spend it without the additional weight of having hurt you for nothing. I have made my own peace with what our marriage was and was not. I would like the chance to make a different kind of peace before this is over." She left. Margaret sat alone in the small sitting room with the packet of letters in her lap, and for a long moment she could not bring herself to untie the ribbon, because some part of her understood that whatever was inside would change something in her that could not be changed back. She untied it anyway. The first letter was dated 11 years and 3 months ago, written, Margaret realized with a swift, painful calculation, less than a month after Edmund's mother had died, in the exact window of time when he had begun pulling away from her without explanation. My dearest Margaret, it began, in his careful, slanting hand, I am writing this because I cannot say it to your face, and I despise myself for the cowardice in that sentence even as I write it. The letter went on, and Margaret read it with her hand pressed against her mouth, because in it Edmund had written, with a vulnerability he had apparently never once permitted himself aloud, everything he had told her the previous night in the sick room, the fear of loving someone enough to be undone by losing them, the watching of his own grief over his mother and the terror it had instilled in him, the decision, made in the depths of that terror, that the only safety available to him was distance. But the letter did not stop there, the way his sickroom confession had been forced to stop, interrupted by exhaustion and the limits of a failing heart. The letter continued, page after page, written and rewritten across what must have been years, each new page dated weeks or months after the last, an unbroken record of a man who had never once stopped loving her and had simply never found the courage to say so while there was still time for the saying to matter. The final letter in the packet was dated only 6 weeks earlier. I do not know how much longer I have, Edmund had written. Abernathy does not say it directly, but I have seen the way he looks at me when he listens to my chest, and I am not a fool. I find myself, in these last weeks, returning again and again to the same impossible arithmetic, that I traded 11 years of being loved by the one person who ever truly understood me, in exchange for a kind of safety that turned out to be nothing more than a slower, quieter way of dying. I think, if I am honest, that I began dying the day I let you believe I did not need you. Everything since has simply been the body catching up to what the heart already knew. Margaret sat with the letters in her lap and wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep in 11 years, not the careful, contained grief of a woman managing her own disappointment, but the full, unguarded grief of someone finally given permission to feel the entire weight of what she had lost and might, impossibly, against every reasonable expectation, still have the chance to recover. It was 3 days later, with Edmund's color improved enough that Abernathy permitted him short periods out of bed, that the second truth of the household came to light, and this one belonged entirely to Margaret. She had gone down to the estate's small chapel in the late afternoon, a habit she had kept quietly for years, a place to sit with her own thoughts when the house grew too full of other people's needs, and found, waiting for her in the chapel's narrow vestibule, a solicitor she did not recognize, accompanied by an older woman whose face carried a familiarity Margaret could not immediately place, though something in the shape of her eyes tugged at a memory too old and too faded to surface. Cleanly. Miss Hale, the solicitor said, with the careful formality of a man delivering news he had been instructed to deliver in person rather than by letter. Forgive the intrusion. My name is Mr. Pell. This is Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. She has been searching for you for some months, since the death of her husband revealed certain matters in his private papers that required clarification. Margaret looked at the older woman, whose eyes, pale gray, set wide, achingly familiar in a way Margaret could not yet name, had filled with tears even before either of them had spoken a single word of substance. You have your father's eyes, Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice trembling. I would have known you anywhere. Margaret's chest tightened with a confusion that had nothing yet to do with understanding and everything to do with instinct, the body recognizing significance before the mind has caught up to the facts. I do not know you, she said carefully. No, Mrs. Whitfield agreed. You would not. You were 3 years old when your mother died, and I was told, by my husband, that you had died with her. He told me this for 30 years, and I believed him, because I had no reason not to, and because grief does not invite scrutiny of the people who deliver it to you. Mr. Pell stepped forward with the careful, measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering complicated truths in small, digestible pieces. Mrs. Whitfield's late husband, he explained, was your mother's brother. Your uncle, Miss Hale. When your mother died of the fever that took your father as well, the same fever, in fact, that you have always understood took only your father, your uncle arranged for your placement in the household of a family friend, citing an inheritance dispute he did not wish complicated by a surviving child. He told his own wife, Mrs. Whitfield here, that you had succumbed to the same fever as your parents. He told the family who raised you that your mother's people had no interest in your welfare. Both statements were false, constructed, we believe, because your mother's small estate, a property in Lincolnshire, modest but unencumbered, would otherwise have passed directly to you upon your majority, and your uncle had use for the income it generated in the interim. Margaret sat down heavily on the narrow bench inside the chapel door, her mind working through the arithmetic of an entire childhood reorganizing itself around facts she had never possessed. "He stole from a 3-year-old, she said, half to herself, the word strange and metallic in her mouth. "He did," Mr. Pell confirmed. "And he maintained the deception for 30 years, until his death 4 months ago forced an accounting of his affairs that could no longer be managed quietly. Mrs. Whitfield discovered the truth in his private correspondence. She has spent the month since attempting to locate you." Mrs. Whitfield crossed the small vestibule and knelt before the bench, taking Margaret's hands in both of hers with a tenderness that felt, despite the strangeness of the entire encounter, immediately and inexplicably familiar, the particular warmth of family recognizing family across a gap of decades and deception. "The Lincolnshire property is yours," she said. "It has been yours since you were 3 years old, and it has been generating income for my husband's estate every year since, money that was never his to take. Mr. Pell has the full accounting. The property itself, a modest manor, a working farm, nothing grand, but entirely yours, entirely unencumbered, entirely a future that no one can take from you the way Lucia Voss attempted to take Ashcombe from you 3 days ago." Margaret looked at the woman kneeling before her, her aunt, an entire branch of family she had never known existed, restored to her in a single afternoon alongside a property and an income and a future that had been quietly waiting for her, unclaimed, for 30 years, and felt the particular vertigo of a life rearranging itself faster than the heart can follow. "I have spent 11 years believing I had nothing," she said. "I packed a single bag 3 days ago because I believed, entirely, that a single bag was the full measure of what I had built in this world." "You had more than you knew," her aunt said gently. "You have always had more than you knew. It simply took 30 years of one man's cruelty, and 4 months of careful unraveling, for the truth to find its way back to you." Margaret thought, in that moment, of the bag still sitting in the small room she had been given near Edmund's chamber, the bag she had packed believing it represented the entirety of her worldly possessions, 2 dresses, a comb, a tin of letters, a wooden bird, and she felt something shift inside her that was not quite grief and not quite joy but some entirely new combination of the two, the specific vertiginous feeling of discovering that the floor beneath a decade of careful, contained suffering had never actually been as solid or as final as it had seemed. She left with one bag, she thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only at the strangest moments. And she had no idea, walking down those attic stairs, that she was about to be handed back an entire life. She told Edmund that evening, sitting beside his bed in the soft amber light of the single lamp Abernathy permitted now that the worst of the danger had passed, and she watched his face move through disbelief, fury at the dead uncle who had stolen 30 years from a 3-year-old girl, and finally something that looked very much like wonder. "You have a home," he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the words. "An income. A family." "I have all of those things," Margaret said. "And I have had them, apparently, since before I could walk steadily across a room, and never once knew it." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on her face with an intensity that carried none of the careful distance of the previous decade. "Then you do not need this house," he said. "You do not need Ashcombe, or Lucia's good graces, or my name, or anything I might have offered you 11 years ago and was too great a coward to actually give." "No," Margaret agreed. "I do not need any of it." She paused, looking at him in the lamplight, and found herself wanting, suddenly, to say the rest of it aloud, not the practical accounting Mr. Pell had laid out so carefully, but the part underneath it, the part that had kept her awake the previous 2 nights, turning the whole revelation over in her hands like a stone whose weight she had not yet learned to carry. "Do you know what frightened me most," she said, "when Mrs. Whitfield told me about the property and the income and the family I never knew I had?" Edmund shook his head slightly, watching her with the careful attention of a man who understood that whatever she said next mattered more than anything Abernathy had told him about his own heart. "I was afraid it would make the last 11 years meaningless," Margaret said. "I had built my entire understanding of myself around being a woman who endured this house out of necessity, who stayed because she had nowhere else to go, who loved you in silence because silence was the only currency she possessed. And then I learned that I had never needed to stay at all. That I could have left a decade ago and lived comfortably in Lincolnshire and never thought of Ashcombe again. And for one terrible hour, sitting in that chapel, I thought, if I never needed to stay, then what was any of it for? What were the 11 years? What were they for? Edmund asked quietly, and there was real fear in the question, the fear of a man bracing to learn he had been, after all, only an accident in the path of a woman's longer journey. They were for this, Margaret said, and her voice did not waver. Not because I had no choice. Because I chose it, every single day, without knowing I possessed any other option, which means the choosing was never compromised by necessity at all. I believed I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. I understand now that I stayed because some part of me, even without words for it, knew that nowhere else was where I wanted to be. Edmund's hand tightened around hers, and when he spoke his voice had roughened with something he no longer tried to hide. That is the most generous thing anyone has ever said to me, he said. I do not know that I deserve to be loved by a woman who could have walked away clean and chose instead to remain and be wounded by my cowardice. You did not make me choose to stay, Margaret said. You made the staying harder than it needed to be. Those are different failures, Edmund, and only one of them is unforgivable. She brought his hand to her face, the way she had in the attic 3 days before, and felt the warmth of his palm against her cheek carry none of the grief it had carried then. I am not interested in unforgivable failures tonight. I am interested in what we build with whatever time remains to us, however much or however little that proves to be. Something in Edmund's expression flickered, not quite fear, but the particular vulnerability of a man who has spent a decade assuming he would never have to risk the answer to the question he was about to ask, because circumstance had always conveniently prevented him from having to ask it. Then why, he said carefully, are you still sitting in this chair? Margaret looked at him, at the man who had loved her in silence for 11 years, who had written letters he never sent and confessions he never spoke, who had built an entire careful architecture of distance out of grief and fear and had only found the courage to dismantle it on the floor of an attic with his heart failing beneath his ribs, and she found that the answer, when it came, required no deliberation at all. Because I am not staying out of need, she said. I am staying because I choose to. There is a considerable difference, Edmund, between a woman who remains because she has nowhere else to go, and a woman who has an entire house and an entire fortune and an entire family waiting for her in Lincolnshire, and chooses, instead, to sit in this chair beside you. Edmund reached for her hand, and this time there was no tremor of illness in his grip, only the steady, deliberate warmth of a man finally allowing himself to hold on to the thing he wanted without bracing for the cost of losing it. I do not deserve the choosing, he said. Perhaps not, Margaret agreed. But I find I am no longer interested in distributing my affection according to merit. I am interested in giving it to the person I actually want to give it to, deserving or not, and dealing with the consequences as they come. He laughed then, a real laugh, rough with disuse but entirely genuine, the first true laugh Margaret had heard from him in over a decade, and the sound of it, more than anything that had been said in either direction over the preceding days, told her with absolute certainty that whatever time remained to them, however brief or however long Abernathy's careful predictions turned out to be, it was going to be spent differently than the 11 years before it. Edmund Voss did not die in the weeks that followed, as the doctor had feared, nor in the months after that. His heart, examined more carefully by a specialist summoned from London at Margaret's insistence, proved to have been weakened by years of unmanaged grief and isolation rather than by any irreversible structural failure, and with rest, and care, and the particular medicine of finally being loved without reservation, he recovered a measure of strength that Abernathy himself called, with careful professional understatement, remarkable. Lucia Voss obtained a quiet legal separation within the year, citing irreconcilable circumstances that satisfied the curiosity of no one in society and the private understanding of everyone who actually knew the household. She moved to a small property near Bath that her own family connection secured for her, and she wrote to Margaret once, the following spring, a brief letter that said only, I hope you have found, in each other, what I never expected to find in my own marriage and have since discovered I am genuinely glad to have witnessed in someone else's. It was, in its own restrained way, the kindest thing Lucia had ever said to her. Margaret's aunt, Eleanor Whitfield, became a frequent presence at Ashcombe in the years that followed, and the Lincolnshire property, restored fully to Margaret's name, its accumulated income returned in full by the careful, relentless work of Mr. Pell, became not a place Margaret needed to flee to, but a place she chose to visit, a second home rather than a final refuge, proof every time she walked its modest grounds that she had never, in fact, been the woman with nothing that 11 years of quiet servitude had nearly convinced her she was. She married Edmund the following autumn, in the small chapel where Mr. Pell had once found her with her aunt, in a ceremony attended by perhaps 20 people but witnessed, in the fullest sense, by every silent ear that had finally been given permission to speak. On the morning of the wedding, as she dressed in the same small room where she had once packed a single bag believing it held the entirety of her future, Margaret opened the tin of letters tied with string, the one possession from that bag she had never once considered leaving behind, even when she believed she had nothing else, and added to it the packet Lucia had given her. The years of unsent confessions finally joined together in the same small container, finally complete. She had left this house once with one bag, believing herself to be carrying away nothing of consequence. She understood now, fastening the tin closed for the last time before going down to be married, that she had been wrong about that morning in every particular way it was possible to be wrong. She had not been leaving with nothing. She had been leaving with 11 years of a love that had simply not yet found its voice, with an inheritance that had been quietly waiting for 30 years to be claimed, with a future that was considerably larger and considerably more hers than anyone in that house had ever permitted her to imagine. She had left with one bag. She had taken, without anyone fully understanding it at the time, the entire future of the estate. And she had returned to claim it on her own terms, which was, in the end, the only way that mattered. Margaret Hale spent 11 years believing that love, once silenced, could not be recovered, and that a life measured in a single canvas bag was the full and final accounting of everything she had built. She was wrong about both of those things, and the unraveling of that wrongness, the letters that were finally spoken aloud, the inheritance that had been quietly waiting all along, the choice to stay not from need but from love, is the story this channel exists to tell. If Margaret's story found you somewhere real today, if you have ever believed that the quietest years of your life were also the emptiest, only to discover later how much had been growing beneath the silence the whole time, then you already understand exactly why we tell these stories. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now if you have not already. Hit the bell so the next story finds you the moment it goes live. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell us honestly, did you see Margaret's inheritance coming, or did it catch you exactly the way it caught her? Share this with someone who needs to remember that the bag you leave with is never the full measure of what you are worth. The next story is already waiting. We will see you there.